Welcome to the Chaos Return deck guide for GOAT format. What a great deck to do a deck guide for. This is a deck that was originally theory crafted on this very channel a few years ago, went on to now become one of the premier top tier decks in GOAT format. One of, I would say, top 5 most popular decks, along with Standard Chaos, GOAT Control, Warriors, and Chaos Control. So yeah, let's get right into it here. Just a quick disclaimer of what this guide is not going to cover. There's another sort of deck called Dimension Fusion Turbo that's kind of more combo heavy, based around like Bazoo, Magical Merchant, Thunder Dragon, Dimension Fusion with, some Chaos Sorcerers and whatnot. I definitely consider that to be a different deck than this. Also, kind of recently, there's been a few people playing like a Strike Ninja return build, which is actually very similar to this. You could argue it's almost the same strategy, but I'm not really going to talk about that today. Quick summary of how Chaos Return works in general. So this might be a little confusing, but it's a mid-range deck with an OTK finish. So what do I mean by mid-range? Basically, mid-range is, if we consider aggro to control to be a spectrum, mid-range is right in the middle. So against the control decks in the format, you're being aggressive, but then against the aggressive decks in the format, you're doing the opposite. You're trying to wall on cards like Gravekeeper, Spy, and Shining Angel, which we'll talk about later. The possible OTK finish comes from return. So unlike other Chaos decks, we're not very card advantage focused. Instead, it's kind of like, hey, we're just going to try to keep our head above water until we can pop off a return for game. And then it's also kind of an anti-meta deck in the sense that we're using cards like Zaborg, which are not necessarily good in a vacuum, but are good versus the popular decks. We'll talk about that later. So now let's talk about the core Chaos Return cards. This is pretty much the core of the deck, and this is how, again, a few years ago, I started theory crafting the deck with just these cards. The idea, Chaos in general, that has been a very popular strategy in GOAT format for a long time. And what I constantly noticed was, because everyone was playing a bunch of Gravekeeper Spies and a bunch of Dekoichis, along with 2 Nobleman of Crossouts, you would often see players build these large banish piles without even trying to, right? It just sort of happened naturally based on the way the game played out. So I thought, why don't we just, run those cards just like everyone else, but then also play Return as kind of this free finisher, so to speak, right? This isn't a card that we have to work for. It's not a card that has a specific life point requirement, right? Unlike Cyberstein, we don't have to, keep our life points above a certain amount or anything. So the sort of the effort and the opportunity cost of using Return is very low. Now, you will occasionally see some quote-unquote Chaos Return decks only playing 1 copy of Return. To me, it's like, if you don't think Return is good enough to play 2 copies of, then you should probably just play a different deck, right? You don't, base your deck around an unsearchable card and then decide, oh, I'm only going to play 1 copy of it. There are some decks, against the aggro decks like Warriors, Return isn't as strong, but even Warriors, they play a bunch of Kaikus, and sometimes they'll just, again, kind of let you build this big banish pile for free. So the idea is we're sort of playing good cards, the same good cards that a lot of other decks are playing, but hey, we also get to sort of splash in this Return for free to kind of win games out of nowhere. And then, of course, we're going to need some additional support for that. The cards that we're playing to banish our own cards, obviously, Blackluster Soldier, we all know a Chaos deck is playing that. And then you have either 2 Chaos Sorcerers, that's kind of the norm, or you have 1 Chaos Sorcerer and 1 Bazoo. I generally think the second copy of Chaos Sorcerer is better than the first Bazoo. That's kind of what's standard these days. If you look at deck lists from 2 or 3 years ago, you'll see people playing the 1 Bazoo more often. Bazoo, it's not the worst card in the world. One thing I don't like, though, is that it can't attack over a Kaiku, right? Because it only has 1600 attack, and then you can't banish anything, so that's a little awkward. But if you decide to play some good monsters that aren't light or dark, so say, for example, you're playing Exiled Force or Tribe Infecting Virus, Bazoo can banish that, and then you can return that monster, but usually you don't really play those cards anyway. So for the most part, I just think Chaos Sorcerer, we all know, one of the most powerful cards in GOAT format. And in this deck, it does everything, right? It fuels our return and it's card advantage. So I would just go with the 2 sort copies. And then the 1 DD Warrior Lady I want to mention, also very, very important. It's going to be searchable regardless of what build you're running. You're going to have a way to search this out. And Warrior Lady's nice because, like, hey, it deals with a threat and then it banishes itself and then you can return it, right? In a way, kind of like a mini Chaos Sorcerer. Banishes something and then you can return. And then the hard part with building these decks is figuring out what lights you're going to play. We already went over some of the darks, right? The Dekoichis and Spies. No surprise there. Zaborg, though, is, in my opinion, one of the more important cards. It allows you to deal with things like Spy and opposing Chaos monsters. It's just a very strong card against other Chaos decks. It also just has a big body, right? So if Zaborg ends up in your grave somehow, you can banish it to one of your Chaos monsters, and then you can return it, and it's got 2,400 attack, and 2,400 is pretty good. And then, I guess we'll talk about the Shining Angel versus the Warriors. Shining Angel, people will say, is not the best card in GOAT format. However, it gets the job done, right? It's kind of a light that replaces itself. Sometimes what you can do is, like, if your opponent has kind of a smallish monster in play, like a Breaker, you can just play the Shining Angel, attack into their Breaker, get all the other Shining Angels, put them in their grave, and that kind of thins your deck out, puts lights in there. I also just like it. It's kind of what I call a flex monster in that it can be defensive or offensive. And that has value in GOAT format, even in 2025. And of course, it searches our Warrior Lady, which, as we discussed, DD Warrior Lady is a very good card. And one thing that I also like about it is that it has synergy with Zaborg, very mild synergy, but in that, your Shining Angel, if your opponent attacks it, you can search another one, and then it's going to stick around to be a tribute for Zaborg. So playing these Shining Angels that don't really die that easily does make your Zaborg a little better. If you decide to not play Shining Angels, then I think playing 2 Zaborg can be a little more questionable. Most builds of Chaos Return play some number of Blade Knights, 0 to 2. A lot of them play 2. Occasionally you'll see a build that plays 0, but Blade Knight is pretty good. The downside to Blade Knight in this kind of deck is that you can have Chaos monsters or Zaborg clogging your hand, which can sometimes make it hard to get it to that 2,000 stat. And in certain matchups, that could be relevant, right? If your opponent has, I don't know, say they've got a Tribe or a Breaker or a Kaiku, whatever, you want your Blade Knight to have 2,000. The other effect, of course, is very good. We can deal with Magician of Faith, Dekoichi, Knight Assailant, etc., but not Gravekeeper Spy. Ninja Grandmaster can deal with Gravekeeper Spy. It can also deal with a defense position Chaos Sorcerer if your opponent happens to do that play. And then, if you're playing these two, what people do usually is they have either the Shining Angel to search DD Warrior Lady, or they have the Blade Knight and the Ninja plus a copy of Reinforcement of the Army. So you can search the Blade Knight, the Ninja, or the Warrior Lady. The kind of Rhoda Warrior build is like a little more aggressive and low to the ground. The Shining Angel build is a bit more utility based. And, again, you have Shining Angel, which you can set to bait out something like Mind Control, which you can't do with these two. But we'll get into the differences between these builds once we look at actual deck lists. Not much to talk about here. Obviously, like Breaker, MST, Heavy. No surprise we're playing those. However, Dust Tornado, pretty important. Most builds will play 1 Dust Tornado, some play 2. What's nice about Dust Tornado is that you can use its second effect to set a return from your hand and then use it on a following turn. Technically, you could also use the second effect to set like a Solemn from your hand if like you're trying to sort of play around Heavy Storm or something like that. So yeah, Dust Tornado, a lot of utility there. Another thing that I want to mention is that nowadays in GOAT format, Chaos decks in particular play like a lot more chainable stuff. So like MST and Dust Tornado, you really want to be using in the end phase on a card that was just set that turn so that they don't like chain a Jar of Greed or chain a Raigeki Break or something. So that's part of the reason that we really like Dust Tornado. But these two are staples too. And then just kind of like some disruption stuff that kind of offers some minor help to your game plan. Solemn Judgment, you pretty much always play 3 of. There are some exceptions. You will see occasionally builds that don't play the Solemns, but Solemns, you kind of use them the same way that most other decks use Solemn, which is you're not really trying to Solemn something early game, because paying like 4,000 life on turn 1, turn 2 is not a great way to start off the game, but it can often be used to ensure an OTK. So, you have whatever, a return set, a Solemn set, you return all your guys for game, and then, they have Mirror Force, well, I have Solemn. So it's still game. Solemn also kind of has that synergy with Blade Knight, where it's like, hey, it lets you set all of your back rows and a Solemn, keep the Blade Knight at 2,000 without having to worry about Heavy Storm. Dust Shoot is kind of also nice in that it's kind of performing a dual role. It's like this anti-chaos card, which we all know and love, but it's also a card that you can use to see if like the coast is clear to OTK. Like if you Dust Shoot your opponent early in the game and you see like, they don't have a mirror, they don't have a torrential, I can go for game. Or, if it's post side and you've like brought in mind controls, you can use Dust Shoot to get info about their hand, see if they have a good target to mind control, stuff like that. So it definitely helps you get more value out of your cards and in a way helps you OTK. Book of Moon, I think, is sort of an underrated option in this deck that people don't really talk about, particularly the Shining Angel build. It really does a lot. It definitely pulls its weight. Some people hate Book of Moon, but yeah, most of these builds are playing 2 copies. Why? Well, we've got plenty of flip effects. We can book our Dekoichi, we can book our Spy, we can, book our Chaos Sorcerer when our opponent tries to snatch steal it, or it can be just as simple as, hey, we like attack our opponent with the Shining Angel and they Sakuretsu armor it, and then we play book to save it, which is pretty cool. So yeah, you usually play 3 Solemns, 2 Dust Shoots, 2 books. That is sort of the standard number. And then, of course, like, you got all the staples in the deck. I'm not going to list them off. If you want to see the full list, well, don't worry. The deck lists are coming up, and you'll get to see all the other staples that this deck plays. So this is pretty much the standard build, the most common build. And, it's got all of the cards we mentioned, like the Traps. It's got the Dust Tornado, the Solemns, the Dust Shoots, so on and so forth. It's got the double books. It's got the Shining Angels with the 1 target to search out being DD Warrior Lady. That's fine. It's got double Blade Knight. The one change that I think you could make to this deck, because this build originally came from my channel, I think 2 Blade Knights, I don't necessarily think you need 2. If you wanted to cut that Blade Knight for something like a Kaiku or like 1 Ninja Grandmaster, or even if you wanted to cut it for like a Magician of Faith, I think that would be totally fine. But yeah, you'll see we basically got all the cards that we talked about. If you have any questions about this list, of course, leave a comment. But this is the most common list. This one here I got from a first place from Nate Dogg, but again, the list originally comes from my channel. This alternative Chaos Return deck list here is by Ludi Pable1. Apologize if I mispronounced your name. This got top 8 in an online GOAT format tournament a while back. And, with any deck list, I'm never going to say it's perfect, but it's great at demonstrating the concept of how you can build a Chaos Return deck if for whatever reason you decide that the Shining Angel package is not for you. Here we have 2 Reinforcement of the Army. Sometimes you see only 1, but here we have both copies. And for the targets, we have 2 Blade Knight, a Warrior Lady, a Donzalug, Exiled Force, and Ninja Grandmaster. So that's 6 targets. Pretty good ratio there overall. You'll notice here that we only have the 1 Chaos Sorcerer. We don't have 2, and that's because we don't really have a lot of lights here. We're also even cutting Zaborg. Not even a single copy of Zaborg. Frankly, I think that's something that you could change. I think you'd be better off playing 1 Zaborg. But here we have no Zaborg. Our lights here are basically just the 2 Blade Knight and the 1 Ninja Grandmaster Warrior Lady. Sometimes that can end up in your grave. But we don't have a lot of lights here. I think this is a little risky, this low light count. But, we've still got like our 3 Spies, 3 Dekoichis. Donzalug here, we're almost leaning more into aggro with this build. Like I said, when you're not playing the Angels, usually you're a bit more aggro. But here the idea is like Reinforcement of the Army, it can either search a light or it can search a dark. And Donzalug isn't too bad as far as darks go. Interesting thing about the Traps, even though we're pretty aggro, there's no Solemn Judgments. I don't know if this was maybe like a personal preference, kind of thing. Me personally, I would probably rather just be playing Solemns than Jargreeds, but Jargreed is still a good card too. We've also got Call the Haunted, which can get back something like an Exiled Force or a Tribe. The other route that you could go is you could consider like trying to fit like a Bazoo in here somehow, and then like I mentioned, you can Bazoo banish like your Tribe and then return it back and pop off. Other than that, pretty standard. The only thing, I don't know, I also don't really like that we're playing 0 Book of Moons. We got some pretty juicy Book of Moon targets here. We still got like the 3 Spies and the 3 Dekoichis. So I don't think in this build you need to play 2 Book of Moons, but I would like to see at least 1. So yeah, this is still, a perfectly valid way to play the deck. And, if you go back to the previous slide, you could even take that Angel deck and just kind of keep it exactly the same, but just cut like the Angels for like the Ninja Grandmaster and a reinforcement of the army or something. In this case, the deck goes a bit in a different direction. Totally valid too. So as far as like what the strengths of this deck are, why is it that you want to play this deck? Basically, it's that it just does really well against other Chaos decks. We have pretty like limited matchup data in GOAT format, but the small amount of data that we do have indicates that this deck is favored against the standard Chaos build, and that's basically because we have Return, we have Zaborg, really great card, we have some stuff in the side that we can bring in, which we will talk about, but also I think really important here is that it does well against the cards that people traditionally think of as being anti-Chaos. So classic example is Kaiku. Some people these days, some Chaos decks will main like 1 or 2 Kaikus for the mirror, and we're just like, oh, great, you want to banish all our stuff? Thanks for fueling our return. And Mind Control, largely the same thing. People will sort of blindly side in Mind Controls against you because, oh, it's Chaos, and Mind Control is good against Chaos, but we can be pretty good at baiting Mind Controls out with Shining Angel, DD Warrior Lady, Sangan, etc. So yeah, we don't really get hard countered by the same stuff that other Chaos decks do. And you kind of get to punish people for making that mental shortcut of just thinking that, oh, we're a Chaos deck, therefore the stuff that's normally good against Chaos is also good against Chaos Return. Yeah, kind of what I talked about with Shining Angel in particular is that all of our monsters are just kind of like generically good. They just have good stats. They can be both offensive and defensive. Even like Dekoichi's kind of like a good example of that, where it's like, hey, we can just set it, and maybe we'll just draw a card, or we can start like attacking for 14. So we can often kind of poke for damage for relatively low commitment, get our opponent down to whatever it is, 5,000 or something, and then kind of return for game. So the weaknesses are, when it says here, like difficulty coming back from early leads, I'm mainly talking about like card advantage. This deck doesn't have like a ton of card advantage. It doesn't have like the super nut draws that other Chaos decks have. But at the same time, realize that like statistically speaking, that won't happen a lot, right? Like if we're going against a Chaos deck and they have like multiple Trinity pieces in their opening hand, we're probably going to have a hard time. But then of course you just got to realize, well, statistically they won't have that very often. And then also this deck, like it is in a sense, it is a bit of an anti-meta deck. So while it does pretty well against some of the tier 1 decks, in particular other Chaos decks, and does, I'd say, pretty decent versus Warriors, you might have like a tough time versus the more like tier 2 decks. Even stuff like Goat Control. I know it's crazy to say, but like at this point, Goat Control is like kind of a tier 2 deck, but you're gonna do like kind of poorly versus that. Even something like Earth Aggro, which I don't think is a very good deck in general, this deck doesn't beat Earth Aggro in the sense that like a normal Chaos deck would, because a lot of our cards, again, like Zaborg, great against control decks, but Zaborg is going to be like really bad versus something like Earth Aggro. And then Burn also is going to be pretty tough. Why? Well, mainly because like we're playing a bunch of stuff that tells us to pay half our life points. So, Burn is a real deck. It's something you're going to see. So that is something to be aware of. And we'll talk about that when we move on to the side deck. How to play Chaos Return. I do want to note here that I am going to show a replay because frankly, I think watching the deck in action is better than reading, but I still have some points here. So with your monsters, a lot of it comes down to what monsters you trade for what cards. So for example, like in a normal deck, if you're playing like 3 Gravekeeper spies, often your goal is to not get your spy hit by a crossout. Whereas in this deck, it's the opposite. You're trying to get your Dekoichi hit by a crossout. You're trying to get your spy hit by a crossout to build up those big banish piles. Whereas something like Shining Angel, on the other hand, you don't want it to get hit by a crossout. Now, sometimes you can set it to bait like mind control, or it's just like a mind game or something. But again, it's like we don't have a ton of card advantage. So what we have to do is make sure that our cards trade for the right cards that our opponent has. Dust Shoot, we already talked about. Very useful to get info with it. And then the idea is, hey, we Dust Shoot, look at our opponent's hand, and then use that to see if we can push for damage. That might be game with a return, or it might just be like, hey, I'm gonna, flip my spy, tribute my spy for Zaborg, and I know they don't have Torrential or something. Judgment, we already talked about. That is basically used to either protect your big pushes, which is how Solemn Judgment was used in decks like Teledad back in the day, or just for countering something broken, right? Your opponent plays a BLS, sometimes you're just gonna have to Solemn it. And Zaborg is very, very important, really in any control matchup versus Chaos decks in particular. So yeah, the little card advantage that you do have often comes from Zaborg, like flipping a Dekoichi, tribute for Zaborg, that sort of thing. So the overall game plan is basically just to poke for some early damage and then use return to seal the game later. Pretty straightforward. Again, make sure you watch till the end of the video because I will have a replay. Side deck is fairly straightforward. A lot of it is kind of the same stuff that other decks side, but then some of it is different. So whether you're playing Shining Angel or Reinforcement of the Army, you probably want to side some more targets for that. Even cards that are situational, you might think, well, Roulette Barrel isn't that good, but well, if you can search out Shining Angel, it actually is pretty good. And versus like warrior decks in particular, you often want to side out Zaborg, but then put in another light monster, and then Roulette Barrel is perfect for that role. You also have Jowgen as a card that you can search as Shining Angel. Not too bad either if you're playing Reinforcement of the Army instead. You can side something like Zombira the Dark or Cliff the Trap Remover. There might be other options that I'm forgetting about right now. Then you want some stuff for burn. Often this is just going to be extra Dust Tornadoes. It can also be like Mobius or Jinzo. People point out that like Jinzo, one of the things you can do is if your Jinzo ends up banished, you can activate return to bring back your Jinzo and then counter all your opponent's traps. Against burn, that's not really going to come up very much. So if you like Jinzo, you can side that, but don't expect that like you're going to have huge synergy with it. And then for anti-burn, like you can also have like Mystic Walks or Hysteric Fairy to get rid of Ojama tokens. That's an option too, because Ojama, it kind of does counter return, I'm not going to lie. And then some anti-aggro stuff. I think your matchup game 1 versus the aggro decks like Warrior, I think it's okay, but it's definitely not amazing. So you want to bring in some anti-aggro stuff. Usually it's just going to be like Sakuretsu Armors or Bottomless Trap Hole or maybe even Smashing Ground, just something that says destroy a big monster. And then for anti-chaos, that's pretty much just mind control. I'm not going to lie. You can maybe throw like a Kaiku in your side. That's not bad for, being an anti-chaos card, but mind control is the big one. Post side, this, people might have a hard time understanding this, but like post side, a lot of the way that the chaos matchup goes is my mind controls are better than your mind controls. So mind control, it can be like a huge swing in any sort of chaos versus chaos matchup. But what we can do is we can like set our Shining Angels to bait their mind controls, make them go -1, and then know that our opponent won't have as many cards for them to do the same. Like, yes, occasionally your mind control will hit like a Sangan or something, but they're going to have like a lot less of that kind of card than we are. So usually you side, 2 to 3 mind controls. People will debate like, is 3 too many? I think 3 is totally fine. I've sided 3 mind controls before and done fine with it. If you don't like 3 mind controls, well, then you can only side 2. But mind control is one of those cards that is especially good when you're going second. And you're going to have to go second, well, at least 1 game out of the 3. So I think it's good to have mind control to kind of even the odds there. And then for the fusion deck, well, there's nothing that special summons from the fusion deck. So if you're an IRL player, some of the fusions can be kind of expensive. You don't need a fusion deck. So now let's move on to the replay that I wanted to show you. Here we have Nate Dogg, one of the premier Chaos Return players. He is playing Chaos Return, as you might expect. Oracle, also a very good GOAT format player. He is playing sort of your standard, Chaos Turbo deck, as people call it. And this was from the winners finals of a tournament. I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago. So this is relatively recent. And this is a matchup that you're going to play a lot. So I think there's a lot that we can learn here. I'm not going to talk too much about the, each play, I think. So notice here, Nate Dogg does summon Shining Angel. And the idea is, we don't want our Shining Angel to get hit by a crossout. We want our other cards to be the ones to get hit by a crossout. So putting it in attack makes sense. He sets Ring. I think you could also do Book instead, if I'm being totally honest. But Ring versus Book, there's not going to be a ton of difference. Either way, a Ring or a Book, either one's going to deal with Breaker. But this is a very good start for Nate here because... very good sort of tempo play in the sense that our opponent basically is passing the turn without a monster and Ring dealt him 16. So if this Angel gets in, even just for 14, you're already going to be well set up for a return later. But, we got the Book to protect the Angel, so this all worked out really well. Also, note here, holding the Graceful totally fine. Your hand kind of has a lot of good cards. Often with Graceful, it's good to hold it a bit longer until you kind of know what your opponent's doing, what you want to discard. The only advantage to using Graceful like early in the game is that maybe Graceful draws you into like a dust shoot, and then if you'd done that, you could be dust shooting your opponent perhaps. And this is pretty nice here. We basically did a 2-for-2 trade, got our opponent's Raigeki break out of the way. And no Dark in the grave yet, but whenever we need the Dark, we can just go Graceful, discard the Dark. It's pretty nice. And then, if I recall correctly, I believe Nate just goes for game, right? Discard 2 Darks. We got 2 Darks, 2 Lights. And then, Solomon's playing that role of protecting the push, right? And the nice thing about this play here is that, last turn we got rid of the Night Assailant. So we know that most Chaos decks play 2 Night Assailants. There's only one more that he can really have. And even if that card is a Night Assailant, okay, the Night Assailant would kill the BLS. We'd poke for 37, still have a pretty good chance of winning the game. So yeah, there we kind of just go for an OTK without return. That can happen sometimes too. I mean, a lot of what kind of opens the board up for these OTKs is Zaborg, right? The Zaborg was key in, ensuring that OTK there. So yeah, Nate sets Spy here. Spy's going to get value either way, most likely. If it eats a crossout, that's good. If it doesn't eat a crossout, that's also fine. We might top deck Zaborg or something. So I had to go ahead and thin out the deck now. I mean, you could potentially here summon another monster, try to go for more damage, but then you risk running into Mirror Torrentials, so yeah, I think this is totally fine. Get in for 12, not a bad start. So as Nate here, you can figure decent chances set monsters. Spy might not be Spy, might be, I don't know, probably not a Magician of Faith, but it's either going to be like Spy or Dekoichi. If it's Dekoichi, though, that's fine because we can use Shining Angel to run into the Dekoichi. That's something that I didn't talk about in the guide, but kind of big part of the reason of why Shining Angel is actually a real card. So yeah, Nate's got the Dust Tornado. Pretty nice there. Card destruction is going to help both players. And then Graceful discarding Night Assailant. Pretty strong for Oracle. You know, I think here for Oracle, you could probably just drop the Chaos Sork and just start banishing spies. Or you could even, you know, attack into that Angel and then main phase 2, drop the Sork and yeah, if I were Oracle there, I'd probably just play the Sork and start banishing things. Because I think here, if you're Oracle, you want to try to convert sort of this card advantage lead into a bigger lead. Nate, of course, we know he drew into Zaborg, and then... But, well, you got Dust Shoot to send back Zaborg anyway. Yeah, I don't know. If I were Oracle, I would be playing the Sork and just start cleaning up the field. I have no idea why you would not do that. And, you know, I know some people... Anytime I post a replay, people always get mad at the fact that I'm saying that I don't agree with plays. But this is how we learn, right? Yeah, and then of course by playing the Sork, you would have also been like kind of playing around duo. Yeah, I think Oracle would be having a much easier time if he just played that Sork with Mind Control the Sinister. I mean, that happens sometimes, you know? You know, what could the face down have been? Well, it could have been, couldn't be Spy. All the spies were gone. Could have been, I don't know, could have been like a Magician of Faith or a Dekoichi. Sangin was also gone too. So like the only thing that Nate could mind control that would be a bad hit was, you know, what was Sinister. So yeah, this is kind of anyone's game here at this point. And Nate's doing the play that I talked about before, where you just basically crash your Shining Angels into the breaker just to thin out your deck, right? And then here you can go after the Sinister, which is kind of nice. But in this case, you know, you just force out Saku. I mean, you got 2 Solemns down. You could consider using Solemn there. But I think that that would be a little bit much. I think that'd be a little... I think he'd be jumping the gun there on that Solemn. Yeah, and play Crossout, because, I don't know, might as well, I guess. Pretty crazy how this game played out in such a way that nothing ever got banished, right? We played Crossouts. Unfortunately, our opponent never drew a Crossout, right? That's kind of what is making the return dead, but, you know, that's how it goes. And then the Storm forces the Solemn. And Tribe here, if it calls Spellcaster, everyone's going to lose their spies. And, yeah, I mean, it's kind of rough, like... I agree with Nate. I'd probably say, like, on average, you probably are better off not using the Solemn. And then I guess he MST'd the Ring. I don't know. Maybe he had some sort of read that was Ring. Because if he did, that was a really good MST. Yeah, and then you Solemn the BLS. And then if, you know, if Nate Dogg hadn't MST'd the Ring, he would just be dead right now. But he gets to live another day. Unfortunately, He kind of bricked by drawing the return and then bricked again by drawing the mind control. And that's just kind of how it goes, you know? It's just how it goes sometimes. You can't always have the perfect card in the perfect situation. And yeah, this is kind of one of these situations where Blade Knight, it's like, it could end up being good or it could not end up being good. I'd say you probably want to discard at least one of these Blade Knights. Yeah, Blade Knight and Angel. Yeah, I think that's acceptable. I think that's acceptable. You might even, I don't know, I might even consider just discarding Blade Knight, and keeping Angel in the hand. Because like with Spy and Dekoichi, I don't know, I just feel like it's going to be hard to get value out of this Blade Knight. But we'll see. It's, you know, it's close. I would also set MST here, by the way. Just because you're going to dust shoot. And like, well, if your opponent has Breaker or something, you can send back Breaker with the dust shoot. I'd just set the MST. Swords is an interesting card to side in. I don't really like Swords very much. It's not like a terrible card, but I find it hard to believe that it was like the best option. See, if the Blade Knight was in the grave and the Angel was in our hand, I would definitely like summoning Shining Angel. Blade Knight, though, is not as good here as a Shining Angel would be. Oracle is admittedly kind of drawn a not very good hand, we'll put it that way. Not exactly the best hand. And you want to set both crossouts to boost the Blade Knight? I guess he can. I mean, again, as Nate Dogg here, you kind of know a decent chunk of your opponent's hand. By doing this here, you're also playing around Duo and Dust Shoot, so that's kind of a nice bonus. And here you want to cross out before you flip your Dekoichi because you want to thin your deck out before you draw a card. That's why you do it in this order. So at this point here, like, you know, we don't have return, but if at some point we draw a return, we're going to have a pretty decent return pile. I think this BLS... I mean, if our opponent's back row is nothing, then this would be game. I forget what we saw with Dust Shoot. I don't know. To me, I would save this BLS as insurance. Right? Like, if your opponent does something, I want to have BLS as an out. Because if next turn, say next turn, our opponent, like, top decks a Breaker, breaks our back row, and attacks our Dekoichi, now our hand is just nothing. Our hand would literally just be nothing. And I would want to have a BLS in that kind of situation. So to me, it's like, I don't know, when you're up like quite a lot in terms of both life points and cards, I don't really want to just be throwing our BLS away here. That's, I think, you know, not what I'd want to do. We get to Dust Shoot our opponent, though, which is really nice. Obviously, we send back the Sork. Our opponent could card Destruction right now, but, like, no reason to. You got Swords. I don't know. I disagree with this. I think you need to wait, hoping that you draw, like, Sinister or, well, I don't know. If you drew Night Assailant, it wouldn't even have a target. I guess using card Destruction right now isn't terrible, since you have no Night Assailant targets. Yeah, and then here, how many? We got one more Spy, I think. So yeah, again, you'll notice big return pile if you ever draw a return. doing it in this order to play around Dust Shoot, which is a good idea. Yeah, just set Shining Angel. Maybe bait something out, maybe not. Breaker's interesting. Yeah, you got Breaker and Dust. So you probably just Dust one, Breaker the other, and then, yeah, Mind Control attack for game. So yeah, I guess Mind Control sometimes can be good for that reason, too. So yeah, 2-1 victory for the Chaos Return deck. You kind of get an idea of how it normally plays out, right? In these control matchups, which Chaos Turbo, despite the name, is a control deck, you're basically just trying to go aggro. I think this game, Nate went a little too aggro with the BLS play, but you know, you get a sense of how the deck is supposed to go. So yeah, thanks for watching, and let me know what you guys think about Chaos Return.